we've got an entire episode devoted to the year's most wanted video game, Call of Duty Black Ops 2.
Yeah, we're gonna break down the history of the series, meet the cast of the game, and tell you what we think in a huge two-part review. X-Plane starts right now.
In the burgeoning HD age of gaming, 2012, which was nearly 14 years ago, I've been running wild on a late-stage PS2 Slim since 2008, with games like San Andreas, Gran Turismo 4, and Stuntman. All played, by the way, on an ancient 150-pound CRT with a caved-in power button that gave me slight electric shocks each time I turned it on. But the night of my brother's birthday, around the kitchen table, half-eaten birthday cake and shredded gift wrappings all around, a seemingly giant skyscraper box sat in the center. And inside, we found, was a PlayStation 3. We set it up, shocked ourselves into action, heard the wondrous and atmospheric PS3 startup screen, and realized we had no games for it because Mother Eel thought the PS2 one still worked with it. But the next weekend, Mother Eel took us to the Walmart she worked at and let us pick out a game. This was back when the game demos were on tiny TVs high above the game cases, and the PS3 station contained one thing and one thing only: Uncharted 3, specifically the burning castle section relatively early in the game. We knew then that we had to have it. Father Eel had recently shown us the Indiana Jones series. We were enamored with the action, set pieces, and characters. This was like everything we loved, but in a game. We booted it up as soon as we got home, staring at the spinning ring in the corner, until we were finally met with this. This is what Uncharted 3 means to an eel. Now I know what you're probably thinking, but Missy, why are you talking about 3 when 2 and 4 are the best ones and Drake's Fortune just should have been aborted? Well, you're half right. I admit, not only was I late to the party in a lot of ways for this series, but that I have an insane bias to Uncharted 3. It was the first game I ever played in high definition, right after our CRT was struck by lightning and we finally got a flat screen. But for me, it was a ginormous landmark of the shift in generations that the PS2 was to the PS3. How Uncharted 3 opened my eyes to what games could be. They could be cinematic, have impressive vocal performances, and still be fun to play. Not that all those traits are what make all games good, but it certainly helped to broaden my horizons. Aside from all that, however, I really do think 3 is the best in the series. The refined gameplay, the exploration of characters, the visuals, the set pieces. 3 is the best at showing off what I consider to be the series' strengths. One could certainly argue that 4 has a much more well-crafted story, but I don't think that's what Uncharted was ever really about. In a 2019 IGN interview, series director and writer Amy Hennig spoke briefly about her inspiration for the Uncharted series. In this context, it was how that applied to her approach on a cancelled EA Star Wars project. But I think her words here say a lot about what Uncharted was going for.
I did the same thing that I did for Uncharted, which was, okay, we took these pulp adventure films and deconstructed them, particularly Indiana Jones, of course, and deconstructed them to go, how are they structured? What are the kind of the verbs? What are the requisite parts? And then how do we reconstruct that as a game in an interactive context, but keep that same feeling of pace and propulsion so it feels familiar?
Now, from my experience, I mostly grew up with the original trilogy, and didn't play 4 until probably 2018. Even with that gap from the early to late 2010s, without any real new experiences in the series, Uncharted 3 had constantly been in my rotation. And you know what? Maybe my constant replaying of 3 just broke me over time, but when I first played 4, it felt very different to me. Uncharted 4 is a game that takes itself way too seriously. From the opening hours where we're jumping all around timelines, establishing Sam in order to justify his inclusion in the game, up to where the game peaks in the middle with the climax of Elena and Nate's unbelievably forced conflict, to pretty much everything in between, A Thief's End wants you to feel for its characters, and it's going to try everything in its power, and spend a lot of time talking, arguing, reminiscing, flashbacking, all in an attempt to achieve that goal. And I just really do not care enough. I think it comes down to the game being so...
It insists upon itself.
What does that even mean?
And don't get me wrong, it's still fun to play, the character banter is good overall, the story isn't terrible or anything, but this game revels in the fact that it is attempting to tell a story. A capital S, Lady in the Water, bona fide Neil Druckmann story. Like I was saying earlier, this is not what Uncharted is really about, and I think the lack of super big, exciting set pieces in this game perfectly illustrate how much more time is dedicated to telling a real story. And to clarify, A Thief's End is not completely devoid of any. The armored car chase is fun, there's some decent sequences sprinkled throughout, and the actual playable combat comes the closest to actually making you feel like a badass treasure hunter. Swinging from ropes and stomping on nameless goons and flashy takedowns. but nothing in this game compares to falling out of a cargo plane, escaping a sideways sinking cruise liner, or hanging off of a crashed train car. And that's honestly really disappointing. Not only as the final installment of Nathan Drake, but just from a technical perspective of really pushing the PS4 to its limits. And this game still looks absolutely fantastic, but it is also going to remind you of that every goddamn chance it gets.
Wow. This is a nice view.
Obviously, the difference in tone is likely entirely due to Amy Hennig's departure from Naughty Dog in 2014. A curious situation that we could gossip on and on about, but really, I'm more interested in what her initial pitch for the series finale was, where Sam Drake was an antagonist, but more from a psychological perspective in Nate's life, and him having to reckon with the past. For all these reasons, it's much easier to completely differentiate the series between the original trilogy and the other ones. Let's get to 2 now, because I think the debate between 2 and 3 is arguably more contentious than 3 and 4. I think the perception of 3 for a long time before 4 was that it was essentially retreading old ground. And I will agree, it's more of the same in a lot of ways. And I can completely understand people not liking the desert section or the hallucinations. And really, at a certain point, the debate between 2 and 3 very much comes down to personal preference. Maybe even first in the series bias similar to mine with Uncharted 3. Uncharted 2 was a huge step forward into the concept of cinematic gaming, the idea of taking a pulpy action film and translating it into an interactive medium. To get down to the nitty-gritty for me, Uncharted 3 works much better on a character dynamic level than 2 does. And you'll hear me say that a lot, character. With these games, I feel like character is the real shining star of each subsequent entry, and who you prefer will really determine what game you like over the others. Charlie versus Sam, Elena versus Chloe, Harry versus literally anyone else, etc. But as I was saying, 2 gets very bogged down in interpersonal character conflicts. Especially when Elena is reintroduced and we have the whole silly love triangle between her and Chloe. It's a bit odd for this to run as a B-plot through what ostensibly turns into a save-the-world scenario, with the main villain being an evil warlord wannabe conquistador. But isn't that kind of the point? Deconstructing this narrative device with the heroes and the villains and the love interests is interesting on some level, where the game is self-aware about the dynamic it's presenting and how badly Nate ends up cucking Chloe. But I think the tones kind of clash a bit, where this dynamic is established and then there's Parks and Rec zoom-ins on characters for silly shock and awe. And then 5 minutes later, Elena's cameraman is getting executed in a war-torn apartment building.
Shame.
It just kind of feels weird. The relentless character bantering that played dialogue writing around this time also just bounces off me a little bit now when I go back and play it. We're also not really given any context into what actually makes any of these relationships tick. Chloe and Nate are clearly fucking, and I mean, they're cute, but how did we get here? What happened between Nate and Elena for him to move on to Chloe? Which he's clearly still sore about. How could I not scream at the screen when I have to watch Nate fumble a baddie in real time? Nonetheless, while none of these points are damning indictments of Uncharted 2, they still compound to an experience that's good, but not one that I desperately need to go back and play anytime soon. Now, I spent this whole thing talking up Uncharted 3, but what do I really like about it? Well, as I mentioned before, I love what 3 does with its characters. It frames the story entirely around a personal motivation that Nate has regarding his supposed namesake, Sir Francis Drake. It shows how this also directly connects Nate with Sully, how they first met and became partners, and essentially what their relationship is built on. Which we find out mostly consists of Sully feeling bad for Nate and his circumstances, and the mutual respect they develop for each other during their first run-in in Cartagena. It then pays this off at the end with a whole hallucination sequence at the Atlantis at the Sands. Throughout the beginning of the story, Nate is motivated primarily by his connection to the hunt for Ubar, seemingly believing that it will in some way prove the relation to his namesake that he's been holding on to for so long, implying a fear of inadequacy that he developed during his childhood. Something Uncharted 4 does go into a little bit more, but I like how 3 does more showing and not telling here. Eventually though, Sully is kidnapped, and Nate, of course, cares more about finding Sully than continuing on his journey. Until we get the whole stop the evil forces from obtaining overwhelming power beat, which is definitely the most blatant retreading of 2, but ultimately we get there. And Nate finds out that his biggest fear isn't letting down the name Drake, but losing Sully. And this whole section, with the fire demons and the warping visuals and the music and the sound design, is so captivating to me. Part of me does wish the game would fully pull the trigger, pun intended, on a major character death, but the fake out with Sully works in the same way that, say, Indiana Jones' dad works in The Last Crusade. The potential death of Sully shows us what that would mean for Nate, how insane with rage he gets in this section. It also considerably develops Nate and Elena's relationship, giving an actual reasoning for their on-again, off-again romance, showing how that's directly tied to Nate's obsession, not only with Drake specifically, but with the thrill of treasure hunting in general, how it simultaneously brings them together and pulls them apart. Then there's Charlie and Chloe, who are unfortunately cut way too short in this game. Charlie works great as a moment-to-moment banter machine. Also, seeing Nate actually have someone to talk shop with is great, and I just wish he was in the game more. His inclusion shows us a different perspective of the hallucinogen that we see Drake experience later. Overall, it's good and interesting storytelling. Chloe is just kind of there. She gets seriously reduced in this game, and honestly, she deserves a lot better.
Not worth the price of admission, folks.
And then there's the gameplay. I played Uncharted 2 and 3 back-to-back for this video, and 3 feels so much better. It's really not comparable to me. And again, I'm sure some of it is just inherent bias, but as much as the gameplay is pretty much the same, Uncharted 3 adds a bunch of little additions that go a really long way in terms of improving the overall experience. For starters, the new melee system adds a lot more variety to the encounters. It's very fun to clear out a section of enemies just with hand-to-hand combat, even if much of it can be boiled down to ultra-rapid quicktime events. Objects in the environment being used as weapons or finishers to dispatch enemies also gives the whole thing a very satisfying and textured feel. It's somewhat the same with what I'm going to call the big chonky boy enemies. They're not overplayed, but they also don't add much that regular melee combat doesn't already. They can be interesting as sort of a pivot to 2's big mutant boys or the LMG armored guys, who are way more annoying to deal with. But overall, I'm pretty neutral on them. You can't talk about Uncharted without at least mentioning the music. An epic sweeping orchestral score is a mainstay of the series, and that's no exception in 3. It overall operates the same in all the games. I love how clear each instrument is presented in 3's version of the theme. And obviously, it went a long way for first impressions. Most of the other improvements have to do with just how the game feels to play, which is affected a lot by the improved animations. The reloading, character, and enemy movements especially feel so much smoother, and work to flow the gameplay from section to section. That is, excluding the death animations, which can still devolve into crazy ragdolls and goofy spins. But it's fun still. It's the Uncharted charm. And honestly, that's pretty much it. I may not be making the strongest argument in the world, but mostly I just wanted to show off what I love about one of my favorite games, and take a look at what a couple entries in the series do differently. This may sound strange, but I kind of think Uncharted was the perfect game for me to be introduced to when I was younger. Like I said before, it really opened my eyes to the possibility of games. And maybe if I ever have kids, it'll do that for them too. Thanks for watching. And how do we reconstruct? And Nate finds out that his biggest fear isn't letting down Drake, but losing the name Sully. Save the world scenario with the main villain being an... Hi. Meow. I know, I'm not giving you enough attention right now, are I? Meow. Let's see if I can get some audio in here that doesn't... that isn't, affected by Richard's meows. Yes, his name's Richard. I'm thinking about putting my outtakes at the end. I don't even know what fucking credits I would have to put over it, but I kind of like the idea of like showing my mistakes and that type of shit. I don't fucking know. I'm talking out my ass right now.